cars, pedestrians, bikes, and, of course, golf carts. It wasn't always like this, you know. The 2-lane, 19-mile-long road known as Florida's Scenic Highway 30A is quite far from the sleepy trail that it once was. In fact, just 60 years ago, State Road 30A was little more than 2 tire tracks cut through tall grass, a path of vegetation worn down by the scant few visitors and residents who ventured to this unbelievably remote and pristinely beautiful part of Florida. In many ways, the story of this road is also the story of this place.
His name was William Leslie Miller. They called him Uncle Leslie. This was my mother's father that we're talking about. And one of his children had a lung condition. Doctor had told him that if he moved closer to the ocean, that it would help the daughter with her lung condition. So he got on his horse and rode from New Hope to, which is now Grayton Beach. Now I'm repeating this is what my mother told me. And he found a man building a house on the property that he had filed a homestead. Being the wise old man that he was, he let the man finish his house, and then he told him that he had just built the house on the wrong piece of property. But my mother said that he didn't steal the man's house, that he gave him $100. And of course, back in those days, $100 was a lot of money. They were the first settlers in Grayton Beach, 1902. You know, those people lived off the land. They created a very productive life. He drove some cattle from Washington County. And once they got here, the cattle were free-range cattle. You had the Destin Pass on one end, and you had Inlet Beach on the other end, the Gulf and the Bay, so they had natural barriers. Sometimes you'd have to tether your horse on the beach and walk out in the Gulf and get the cows out of the Gulf, because on real calm days, the cows would walk out in the Gulf where they could get their bellies wet and keep them cool. You have to understand that I was not a resident of Walton County. My mother moved the family to Pensacola because back in those days there was no schools in South Walton County. And once I got 8 or 9 years old, where I could take care of myself, they would put me on the bus and I would ride the bus to the Grayton Beach Road. This bus would stop and the driver would open the door and I would get off with my suitcase. And you know what my suitcase was? It was a brown paper sack from the grocery store. No one ever met me. And I'd start walking into the old place up the Grayton Beach Road. And all those people on that bus, they would look at the window, and they would, as the bus went off, they would look at me, and I was in the middle of nowhere. The only thing they'd see, and not even any traffic on the road. I mean, it was incredible.
In front of the old Miller place, a path was worn into the sandy grass, a rut road formed by 2 wheel tracks. The seeds of 30A were planted. By the early 1930s, a handful of families had built cottages in Grayton Beach and other spots along this stretch of coastline, including around Draper Lake and the area now known as Seagrove. But this place was still incredibly remote, Construction of U.S. Highway 98 and the bridge over the bay at U.S. Highway 331 started to change all that, but barely.
The Butlers are the ones that really developed the city, the town, the community of Grayton Beach. And the old man, as I understand it, took some property that he had at Inlet Beach and traded it for some property at Grayton Beach. Well, Van Ness was a son. Van Sr. was Van Ness's dad, and I don't know the man's name. All they called him was Old Man Butler. He was Van Ness's grandfather.
Van Ness Butler opened the area's first store, Butler General, which also served as a dance hall. Today, it's known as the Red Bar. According to state records, in 1937, Florida officially designated this rut of a road as a state road, although it wouldn't gain the moniker 30A for another 20 years. Electricity came in the 1940s, along with a limit on free grazing cattle, putting an abrupt end to Patterson's grandfather's business.
They couldn't fence all the cattle, so they decided to sell the cattle. And then they moved over to Highway 20 near Freeport, just on the eastern side of Freeport.
A few more families set up camp in the area, but growth was still sleepy and quite slow.
I first started coming to 30A at Grayton Beach when I was an infant. My great aunt had built a house. Mr. Butler, he was trying to develop property and sell land, and he knew some people in Hartford, and that's where my aunt and uncle lived. And so they found out about Grayton. They came down, bought a lot on Western Lake, built a house in 1946. The Butler store was where I grew up hanging out. And that was the heart of Grayton Beach for kids, and especially teenagers. I remember hanging out the window of the store, which became the Red Bar, and listening for cars to see if a car was coming down the asphalt. Because we would be so excited if somebody was coming into town, might be a guy from Defuniak or Freeport or something. Probably my biggest memory is the store. The jukebox, I can still hear songs because once a record got on the jukebox, it stayed there forever, because it was like, they don't come through Grayton very often to change the music. Some of the Seagrove adults would bring beach buggies down to Grayton and have like happy hour with like my grandfather and other people on the beach at Grayton. If you could get a car that would drive on the beach, then you could drive on the beach. And so we would take, for instance, we had an old Rambler wagon, and my dad put big tires on it. My mom was always here with the kids, and she would get in that Rambler and she would just take off, and she would not slow down until she hit almost to the water, because she knew she would get stuck if she slowed down. The beach buggies evolved through the years.
In 1958, the state of Florida began planning to pave the Rut Road and build bridges across the lakes in order to connect the burgeoning beach communities. They also gave it the now famous designation of 30A. With State Road 30 just a few miles north, 30A was an alternate route, hence the A.
As the road, let's say starting at the east end, coming toward the west, they were going to build bridges over the Western Lake, and it was going to go straight through Grayton Beach. Well, saner heads prevailed, and coming out of Seaside, the road makes a big turn toward the north, goes across the little small portions of the lake, and then turns back and goes further inland, and it continues on straight. But the road early on was designed to go right through downtown Grayton Beach. And fortunately, it didn't happen that way.
Construction of the paved road known as 30A began in 1959 and continued until 1961. The two-lane road was 22 feet wide and sliced through arguably some of the most beautiful scenery in the country. Bridges were built over coastal dune lakes, connecting all the small beach communities to each other for the very first time. Paving paradise didn't bring flocks of crowds. Well, not yet anyway.
I believe it was around 1958 that my dad built our first beach house. It was out of his grandfather's barn from Aliqua, and it was like a 20 by 30 foot wood cabin. And it was like 2 lots off of 30A. And so we were able to come down from Defuniak, whether we were living there or had moved out to Texas for my dad to coach football. His name was Mac Anderson. And we would come down to Defuniak, we'd stop in Freeport at the grocery store, we might stop by Casey's and pick up some ice, and we would come down to our beach house here, and we'd pretty much be alone. There were a few families that were here, but we pretty much had it to ourselves. We'd catch our own fish. I fished a lot in the lake, and it was great. We had skis that we would plane off, and we would go to the dunes and we'd ski down the dunes. One of my greatest memories of the beach would be, I think, just being able to spend all day on the beach by myself. I could look left and right and there would not be another person there.
Even with a paved highway, the area's quiet, calm remoteness would remain intact for several more decades. In 1977, responsibility for State Road 30A was transferred to Walton County, and the road was renamed County Road 30A. But something was about to happen that would change 30A forever.